Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really going to kind of wade into this whole Middle East situation.
Yeah.
And specifically, we're hearing a lot about the U.S. getting more and more involved, and
Right.
we wanted to really get into the nuances of that.
Absolutely.
And we've got Yousef Munayyer here. He's a senior fellow at the Arab Center in D.C.,
It's great to be here.
and he's got some really interesting insights into all this. So you ready to unpack this with us?
Absolutely. I think a good place to even start is this whole thing with the U.S. sending troops to Israel.
Okay, yeah. Let's get into that.
Yeah.
So the U.S. has always given Israel military aid.
Right.
But this is different, isn't it? This is like boots on the ground.
Yeah.
How big of a deal is this?
It's a big deal for sure. This is a real shift from how the U.S. has been involved before sending troops. It's not just about surprise anymore. It's like they're really showing whose side they're on.
Right.
And that sends a message, not just to Israel and Palestine, but to like the whole world.
So what are we saying that message is? Like if you're Hamas or Hezbollah,
Right.
how are they going to see this?
Well, for groups like Hamas, they're the Palestinian group that basically runs Gaza.
Right.
And Hezbollah, which is a powerful group in Lebanon, they're going to see this and be like, okay, the U.S. is picking a side.
Yep.
It just makes an already tense situation even more complicated.
And it's interesting you say that because there's this weird thing happening here in the U.S. where you have the Biden administration taking this really strong stance with Israel.
Right.
But then you talk to people and they're saying something totally different. There was that poll that said most Americans actually want the government to be pushing for a ceasefire.
Yeah.
Like they want the U.S. to be using its power to make peace happen.
Absolutely. And you're right. There's this gap between what the Biden administration is doing and what it seems like people actually want. Like they want a peaceful solution.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question becomes, what's driving the administration's decisions?
Okay, so then that makes me wonder, like, how much power does the U.S. actually have here? They give a ton of military aid to Israel, all kinds of weapons. Isn't that kind of leverage? Like they could use that to get Israel to do what they want.
Oh, absolutely. They've got a lot of influence. And there's actually a really good example of this from history.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Tell me more.
So back in the 80s, Israel was bombing Beirut. And Reagan, he's president at the time, he's in a tough spot.
Right.
But he decides to step in personally, calls up the Israeli prime minister and basically says, enough is enough.
Wow.
And get this, he tells him to stop the bombing. And they actually listened. Like within 20 minutes, the bombing stopped.
Sure.
Reagan was supposedly shocked by how quickly they backed down.
Wow, so they really do have that power.
Yeah, and it shows you just how much sway the U.S. has if they want to use it. It really makes you wonder, why not now?
Right. It's a heavy thought.
Yeah.
And it brings us to this really tough part of all this, is civilian casualties.
Yeah.
Israel's saying they're doing everything they can to avoid hurting civilians.
Right.
They're even saying Hamas and Hezbollah are using human shields, which, just makes everything more complicated.
Yeah, that's where it gets even trickier. When you start talking about accusations of harming civilians, you got to look at everything at all sides.
Yeah.
And there are reports coming out that really make you question these claims of protecting civilians. Like there was this UN report that said Israel actually fired on a UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon.
Seriously.
Yeah, and this is a force that's been there for 46 years.
46 years. You think they'd be used to them being there by now?
Right. This isn't some new group showing up out of nowhere. They've been there forever. They're neutral.
So if they're getting targeted, that's a bad sign.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if they're really trying to avoid civilian casualties when they're firing on peacekeepers. And this isn't even the only time something like this has happened. This whole conflict has been full of these situations where each side is saying different things.
And that's what makes this so hard to understand. How do you figure out who to believe? And I know Yousef Munayyer, you mentioned him before, he's been really critical of the Israeli military. He talks a lot about how important good journalism is in situations like this.
Absolutely. He's always saying we can't just take what we hear at face value, especially not in a situation like this.
Especially now with everything going on.
Exactly. Right. And it's not just talk. There was this report in the New York Times just the other day. They talked to all these doctors in Gaza, like 65 of them.
Yeah, 65.
Yeah, 65. And they all said they saw civilians being targeted directly.
Wow, 65. It's not just a few people.
Yeah.
That's a lot of doctors. And that totally goes against what Israel's been saying about trying to protect civilians.
Exactly. And it makes you think about what we were saying before about the U.S. having so much influence. If they can make one phone call and stop a bombing in 20 minutes, shouldn't they be doing everything they can to keep people safe?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it goes back to what we were saying about the disconnect between what the government is doing and what most Americans want if people want peace, and the U.S. has the power to make a difference, why not do it?
Right. It's tough.
Yeah.
And there's no simple answer. But you have to remember that foreign policy is complicated. There are always different countries and groups involved, and they all want different things.
So you're saying it's not as easy as just the U.S. snapping its fingers and saying, everyone stop fighting.
Exactly. There are all these other factors involved. Like, we haven't even talked about how politics here in the U.S. affects what happens over there.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Right, it's all connected. So if you really want to understand why the U.S. is doing what it's doing, you have to look at the whole picture.
Okay, so we're talking about understanding all the different sides of this thing, all the history and the politics and the different perspectives, and we're getting reports that say totally different things, and new information's coming out all the time. Where do you even start? It's kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, it can feel like that. But the important thing is to really think about the information you're getting. Don't just believe everything you hear, even if it sounds convincing.
Okay, so question everything.
Exactly. Look for other opinions, other ways of seeing the situation. Especially look for information from people who are actually there on the ground.
That makes sense, because it's easy to get stuck in your own little bubble just hearing from people who already agree with you.
Exactly. And while that might feel good, it doesn't really help you understand what's really going on. You have to be willing to listen to people who see things differently, even if you don't like what they're saying.
That's hard though, right? To listen to something you disagree with?
It can be, but it's so important, especially with something as serious as this conflict in the Middle East. If you really want to understand it, you have to be open to different perspectives.
Yeah, because it's easy to forget that there are actual people caught in the middle of all this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about politics and history. It's about real people's lives.
Yeah.
And we can't forget that.
Like those 65 doctors. We can't just see them as a statistic. They each have their own story, their own experience that made them want to speak up.
Absolutely. Their stories are so important. They remind us that there are human beings at the heart of all this.
So what can we do then? If we're not politicians or diplomats, how do we even make a difference?
Well, one of the most important things you can do is stay informed. Don't just ignore what's happening because it's complex or upsetting.
So like, don't just scroll past those headlines.
Right. Really try to understand what's going on, because the more you know, the better you'll be able to have conversations about it, to speak up for what you believe in, and to demand better from our leaders.
Okay, so stay informed, stay engaged, even when it's hard. What else can we do?
Supporting organizations that are working to help people is huge. There are groups providing aid, advocating for peace, and documenting human rights abuses. They're on the front lines, and they need all the help they can get.
Right. There's just so much going on. It's like you said, it's not just one problem with one solution.
Exactly. It's going to take all kinds of efforts to make a real difference. You need people pushing for change on the ground, and you need countries working together to find a way forward.
And speaking of working together, that makes me think about the media. Like we were saying, it's so important to look for different perspectives, to not just believe everything you hear. But how do you do that when there's so much information out there? It's like a minefield trying to figure out who to trust.
Oh, tell me about it. And you're right. You got to be careful about what you're reading and watching these days. You have to look for news sources that have a good reputation for being accurate and fair. And watch out for anyone using really emotional language or trying to make things seem overly simple. And honestly, don't be afraid to be skeptical. Just because you see it in print or online doesn't mean it's true.
Right. It's like you almost have to go back to basics. Like, who wrote this? Where did they get their information? What do they try to get me to believe?
Absolutely. Those are the questions you got to ask yourself. Especially now with all the misinformation flying around online, you got to be careful.
This is a lot to think about.
It is.
But maybe that's the perfect place to wrap things up. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a good note to end on. It's a call to action.
Exactly. So, listener's name, we've really only scratched the surface here. We talked about the U.S. getting more involved in this conflict and how that's a big deal. We talked about how public opinion isn't always reflected in what the government does. And we talked about the human cost of all this, the people whose lives are being torn apart.
Right. And I think the biggest takeaway is that this isn't a simple situation. There's no easy answer. There's no good guys and bad guys. It's messy and it's complicated.
Absolutely. And like you've been saying, understanding the complexity is so important if we want to make any kind of difference. So stay curious, keep asking questions, and don't check out just because it's hard.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and a huge thank you to Yousef Munayyer for sharing his expertise with us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.